Vanessa Blake did not steal Eleanor Whitmore's husband first. She opened Eleanor's charity checkbook in front of 300 people and smiled, as if the name on the cover had always belonged to her. The ballroom of the Langford Hotel shimmered in gold light, with white roses stacked higher than the guests' shoulders and champagne glasses catching the glow like tiny mirrors. Outside, Manhattan was cold enough to frost the windows. Inside, every wealthy donor in the room was watching the woman on stage in a silver gown stand beside Richard Whitmore, Eleanor's husband, beneath the banner of the Whitmore Children's Trust. Eleanor stood near the back entrance, still in her ivory coat, one glove half removed, as if she had walked into the wrong life by mistake. She had arrived 8 minutes late because a little boy from St. Agnes Hospital had needed her signature on an emergency grant. That was what the foundation was built for. Not chandeliers, not cameras, not vanity. But Vanessa had found the checkbook before Eleanor found the room. It was the old leather one, dark blue, embossed with Eleanor's initials in quiet gold. The one Eleanor carried for hospital visits, funeral funds, late-night procedures, and families who had already heard the word no too many times. Vanessa lifted it with 2 manicured fingers and laughed softly into the microphone. "Eleanor won't mind," she said, glancing toward Richard as if asking permission from the wrong person. "She's been so tired lately. Someone had to keep the foundation alive." A few guests chuckled. Not loudly. Polite cruelty never needed volume. Richard did not correct her. He stood close enough that his hand rested lightly behind Vanessa's back, a small gesture, almost invisible, but Eleanor saw it. She saw everything. She saw the way Vanessa uncapped the fountain pen. She saw the way Richard looked at the cameras instead of his wife. She saw the charity board members lower their eyes because silence was easier than courage. Then Vanessa bent over the checkbook and wrote $2 million, as if money raised from children's suffering were a party favor. The applause came after a pause, uncertain at first, then growing. Because rich rooms often clapped before they understood what had just happened. Eleanor did not move. Her face stayed calm, but her fingers closed around the glove in her hand until the soft leather folded into itself. On stage, Vanessa signed with a flourish that looked nothing like Eleanor's controlled, angled hand. It was too wide, too dramatic, too hungry. Eleanor's gaze dropped to the antique clock above the ballroom doors. 9:17 p.m., less than 3 hours until midnight. Less than 3 hours before a document Richard believed she had not discovered would become active. A new authorization. A quiet transfer of control. A signature that was supposed to turn Eleanor's life's work into something Richard could hand to another woman like a set of keys. Vanessa looked up, glowing beneath the lights, expecting humiliation to do what it always did, make the wife smaller. Instead, Eleanor took one slow breath, removed her other glove, and stepped forward. Eleanor's steps made almost no sound against the marble floor, but the room felt them anyway. Conversations thinned. A donor near the aisle lowered his glass. Someone from the press turned his camera toward her, hungry for the kind of scene that could be clipped, captioned, and replayed by breakfast. Eleanor did not give them one. She walked through the gold-lit ballroom with her shoulders relaxed, her ivory coat folded over one arm, her expression composed enough to make the silence uncomfortable. Vanessa still held the checkbook open, the fountain pen resting across the page like a trophy. Richard finally looked at his wife, but not with concern. He looked at her the way a man looks at a locked door he thought he still had the key to. For one brief second, Eleanor remembered the first check she had ever written for the foundation. It had not been $2 million. It had been $640, the exact cost of a motel room, 3 nights of meals, and a bus ticket for a mother whose daughter needed treatment at St. Agnes Hospital. Eleanor had been 28 then, sitting under fluorescent lights in a hospital hallway with coffee gone cold in her hand, listening to a father explain that he had already sold his truck. She had not known any billionaires. She had not known how to host a gala. She only knew what it sounded like when decent people ran out of options. The Whitmore Children's Trust had begun at her kitchen table with a laptop, a stack of envelopes, and the small inheritance her mother left behind in a savings account that smelled, somehow, of old paper and lavender. Richard had told her it was sweet. That was the word he used. Sweet. He said it while checking his phone, while kissing her forehead, while promising that once his real estate firm took off, He would help her turn it into something respectable. But Eleanor had done the work before his name meant anything. She called hospitals. She met social workers. She drove 40 miles through rain to deliver paperwork because a fax machine had broken. She learned the difference between a delayed surgery and a denied one. She learned which donors wanted applause and which ones wanted results. Years later, when the foundation became polished enough for glossy magazines, Richard stepped naturally into the photographs. He had the expensive suit, the strong handshake, the last name that looked good beneath headlines. Eleanor let him stand in front because she thought marriage meant sharing the light. She did not understand then that some people do not share light. They stand in it until your shadow looks like proof you were never there. Vanessa had entered that shadow with perfect timing. She praised Richard in public, organized interviews around him, corrected reporters when they asked for Eleanor, and laughed softly whenever Eleanor chose the hospital over the cameras. Now, on stage, Vanessa was holding the evidence of years Eleanor had spent becoming invisible. Eleanor reached the stairs, looked once at the clock above the doors, and saw 9:21 p.m. Then she lifted her eyes to the woman holding her name and extended her hand. Vanessa held the checkbook for half a second too long, as if she believed possession could become permission if enough people witnessed it. The cameras shifted toward Eleanor. A few guests leaned forward, waiting for a crack in her face, a raised voice, a wounded sentence. That would make the night easier to gossip about. Eleanor gave them nothing. She took the checkbook with both hands, the way she used to take medical files from tired nurses in hospital corridors, carefully, respectfully, knowing that paper could carry someone's future. Vanessa smiled for the room. "I hope I did not overstep," she said, soft enough to sound graceful and sharp enough to land. Richard gave a short laugh, the polished kind he used at charity luncheons when he wanted tension to disappear without taking responsibility for it. "Eleanor understands," he said. "The foundation cannot slow down just because she has stepped back." Eleanor looked at him then, not long, not dramatically, just enough for the color to leave the space between them. She had not stepped back. She had been pushed into corners by calendar changes, missing passwords, board meetings rescheduled without notice. Reporters told she was resting. Donors told Richard was handling the larger vision now. None of it had been loud. That was why it had worked. Vanessa reached for the microphone again, but Eleanor lowered her eyes to the open page, and the room seemed to hold its breath around the small movement. The signature sat beneath the amount like a stain in expensive ink. It tried to imitate elegance, but it was too wide at the loops, too heavy at the end, the pressure uneven where Vanessa had paused to admire her own performance. Eleanor knew her own signature the way a pianist knows the weight of a familiar key. She had signed grant approvals in airport lounges, hospital waiting rooms, parked cars, and once on the hood of a volunteer's truck during a snowstorm outside Albany. Her hand never moved like this. Then she saw the corner of something tucked behind the check page. A thin white sheet, folded twice, almost hidden beneath the carbon copy. Eleanor did not pull it out quickly. She slid one finger under the fold, calm as a woman checking a receipt, and lifted just enough to read the first line. Amendment to authorize signatories. Her pulse did not jump. It settled. Beneath the printed words was Richard's electronic approval, time-stamped for 8:43 that evening, linked to a transfer of control scheduled to finalize before midnight. Vanessa was still smiling, still bathing in the warm attention of people who mistook confidence for legitimacy. She did not know Eleanor had built the foundation's fraud safeguards herself after a hospital administrator once warned her that charity money attracted clean suits and dirty hands. She did not know that every unusual signature triggered an alert. Every late-night authorization created a duplicate record. Every change above $50,000 sent a sealed notice to Eleanor's private counsel and Hale Private Bank. Eleanor closed the checkbook with a soft sound that somehow carried farther than applause. She looked at Vanessa and returned the fountain pen. "Keep smiling," Eleanor said quietly. "It photographs well." Then she turned away from the stage, already feeling the first vibration of her phone inside her coat pocket. Eleanor did not look back when the ballroom swallowed Vanessa in applause again. That was the mercy of wealthy rooms. They could pretend nothing had happened as long as the music returned fast enough. A string quartet softened into something bright near the far windows. Champagne was poured. Cameras shifted away from Eleanor because disappointment did not trend unless it broke down in public. She gave them no tears, no trembling hands, no speech for the morning shows. She walked past the dessert tables, past the donors who suddenly found the floor interesting, past a board member who whispered her name but did not step forward. Her phone vibrated once more inside her coat. Then again. Then a third time. In the mirrored hallway outside the ballroom, the sound of the gala thinned behind her until only the bass notes followed her like a pulse. She opened the first message. Hail Private Bank. Unusual signature activity detected. She opened the second. Whitmore Children's Trust Emergency Alert. Pending authorization amendment. The third came from her attorney, Marjorie Bell, a woman who wrote sentences so clean they could cut through marble. Do not sign anything at the hotel. Call me now. Eleanor pressed the elevator button with one bare finger. The doors opened to a glass cabin overlooking the city, and for the first time all night, no one was close enough to study her face. Manhattan spread beneath her in hard white lines and red brake lights, beautiful in the way distant things often are. She called Marjorie before the elevator had dropped 10 floors. How many signatures have they touched? Eleanor asked. There was no greeting, no explanation. Marjorie understood the kind of calm that came after a woman stopped asking to be respected and started checking documents. Paper moved on the other end of the line. For attempted changes, Marjorie said. One electronic approval from Richard at 8:43. One vendor replacement request. One emergency disbursement scheduled for 11:30. And one amendment naming Vanessa Blake as interim foundation liaison with spending authority. The elevator slid past the 28th floor, and Eleanor watched her reflection float over the city lights. Her lipstick was still perfect. That felt almost cruel. Spending authority? She repeated. Temporary, Marjorie said. That is how they worded it. Broad enough to move money, vague enough to deny intent later. Eleanor closed her eyes for 1 second, not from weakness, but to keep the room inside her from moving too fast. Richard had not only stood beside Vanessa. He had opened the gate. He had treated Eleanor's years of hospital visits, late-night grants, and handwritten donor letters like furniture in a house he planned to redecorate. Where was the disbursement going? Eleanor asked. A new event consulting company in Delaware, Marjorie replied. Registered 6 weeks ago. The contact email forwards to Vanessa Blake's assistant. The elevator reached the lobby with a soft chime. Eleanor stepped out into the hotel's cold white marble, where winter air slipped through the revolving doors and brushed her skin awake. She made the second call before the valet recognized her. This is Eleanor Whitmore, she said. Connect me to Alexander Hale. A pause. A click. Then a man's voice, low and steady, answered as if he had already been waiting. Mrs. Whitmore, he said. I was hoping you would call before midnight. Alexander Hale did. Not ask Eleanor what happened. Men like Richard needed explanations because they listened only after damage became expensive. Alexander listened before damage had a chance to dress itself as misunderstanding. Come to the bank, he said. Use the east entrance on 53rd. My security desk is expecting you. The car ride took 11 minutes, though Eleanor felt every red light like a hand placed on the second hand of a clock. The city moved around her in silver streaks and wet pavement, taxis sliding past, steam rising from manholes, late shoppers hurrying beneath wool coats. In her lap, the dark blue checkbook rested closed, heavier than leather should have been. At 10:03 p.m., her car stopped beneath the black awning of Hale Private Bank, a limestone tower that did not advertise wealth because it had never needed to. A guard opened the door before the driver reached the curb. No one asked Eleanor for identification. They already knew her face, her signature, and the quiet emergency attached to both. The elevator inside rose without music, just a soft mechanical hum, and the faint reflection of Eleanor's ivory coat in brushed steel. On the 46th floor, Alexander Hale stood behind a glass conference table with the city spread behind him like a map of decisions. He was tall, silver-haired, and composed in a charcoal suit, but his eyes carried something older than money. Gratitude, maybe. Memory. On the table lay a folder marked Whitmore Children's Trust, Original Incorporation File. Beside it sat a small photograph in a simple frame. Eleanor noticed it before she noticed the documents. A girl in a hospital bed, smiling through tired eyes, holding a stuffed rabbit with one bent ear. Alexander followed her gaze. My daughter, Caroline, he said. 12 years ago. St. Agnes Hospital. Eleanor looked at the photograph again, and the past returned not as a scene, but as a smell, antiseptic, vending machine coffee, rain on winter coats. She remembered a little girl waiting for a procedure delayed by an insurance denial. She remembered signing an emergency grant at 2:18 in the morning while Richard slept at home and told her later she cared too much. Alexander touched the edge of the frame, not sentimentally, but with precision, as if even tenderness had a place on the record. You signed when no one else would, he said. You did not know my name then. I barely had one worth knowing. Eleanor said nothing. She did remember. Not his fortune, not his title, not the bank. She remembered a father in a wrinkled shirt standing beside an elevator, trying to hold himself together because his child was watching. Alexander opened the folder. The tenderness left his face, replaced by the clean focus of a man who had built his life reading risk before it arrived. Now someone is trying to spend your foundation as if it were a household account, he said. They believed your silence meant absence. He slid the first page across the glass. There was Richard's approval, Vanessa's liaison request, the Delaware Company, the scheduled disbursement. Every line was printed neatly, almost politely, which made the betrayal feel colder. Eleanor placed her fingertips on the table, not on the papers. Can it be stopped? She asked. Alexander looked at the clock on the wall. 10:18 p.m. Yes, he said. But only by the one signature they forgot was never decorative. Alexander turned the folder toward Eleanor, and the glass conference table reflected the city lights beneath the paper like cold stars. This is the original operating agreement, he said. Filed 12 years ago, signed before the foundation ever carried Richard's name in a headline. Eleanor looked down at the first page. Her younger signature rested at the bottom in dark ink, smaller than the woman she had become, but steadier than she remembered. Back then, she had signed it at her kitchen table with a hospital badge still clipped to her sweater and unpaid bills stacked beside a cooling cup of tea. She had not been thinking about power. She had been thinking about a child who needed a room near St. Agnes Hospital and parents who had slept 2 nights in their car. Alexander slid another page free and tapped a clause halfway down. The integrity provision, he said. You insisted on it after the foundation's first audit. Any suspected misuse of funds, forged authorization, undisclosed vendor conflict, or emergency transfer above $50,000 permits an immediate freeze of all secondary signatories before midnight on the date of detection. Marjorie Bell joined by speakerphone, her voice precise and calm. Richard never removed it because he never believed it mattered. The board cannot override it tonight. The bank cannot delay it if you activate it. Vanessa Blake cannot claim authority through him if his authority is suspended first. Eleanor read the words slowly. Founder retains sole emergency authority. Her eyes stopped there. Sole. Not wife. Not spouse. Not social chair. Not the quiet woman behind the podium. Founder. The word did not comfort her. It corrected the room. Alexander placed a black fountain pen beside the document. It was not theatrical, not ornate, just heavy enough to remind a hand that ink had consequences. Once you sign, he said, every pending transaction pauses. Richard's access ends. Vanessa's liaison request becomes void. The Delaware disbursement stops before release. The hospital grants remain protected, but all discretionary spending locks until your review. Eleanor listened without blinking. The city hummed beyond the windows, carrying sirens far below, traffic over wet asphalt, the hidden machinery of people going home to lives that still made sense. Her own life was becoming 2 clean halves, before she knew, and after she stopped pretending not to. And my marriage? She asked quietly. Marjorie did not soften her answer. This will make denial impossible. There it was. Not anger. Not scandal. A door closing without being slammed. Eleanor lowered her gaze to her left hand. The diamond ring Richard had given her glimmered under the conference room lights, expensive and suddenly weightless, like something borrowed from a stranger. She remembered him placing it on her finger years ago, promising partnership while photographers waited outside the restaurant. She remembered believing him because belief, at first, had felt like love. Slowly, she slipped the ring off and set it beside the fountain pen. Metal touched glass with a sound so small it seemed to empty the room. Alexander did not. Look at the ring. That was kindness. Eleanor picked up the pen. Her hand did not shake. At 10:46 p.m., beneath the clause Richard had forgotten and Vanessa had never known existed, Eleanor Whitmore signed her name exactly as it had always been meant to appear. Controlled, angled, unmistakably hers. By 11:32 p.m., the ballroom had changed costumes. The speeches were over, the donors had relaxed, and the after-party had begun beneath softer lights on the hotel's mezzanine, where the music was louder and the flowers looked less like charity and more like conquest. Vanessa moved through the room as if she had already inherited it. She accepted compliments meant for Eleanor, corrected a server who called her Ms. Blake, and laughed when someone referred to her as the Foundation's new energy. Richard stayed near her, one hand in his pocket, his smile sharpened by the kind of confidence that came from believing every door still opened for him. The first sign was small. A florist approached Vanessa with a tablet and a nervous smile, asking her to approve an additional charge for the late-night donor lounge. $12,000 for white orchids, imported candles, and branded gift boxes no child at St. Agnes Hospital would ever see. Vanessa barely glanced at the invoice. "Put it through the Foundation account," she said. Mrs. Whitmore approved tonight's discretionary upgrades. She said Mrs. Whitmore like a costume she expected to fit by morning. The florist tapped the screen. A red notice appeared. Declined. Vanessa's smile stayed in place, but the skin near her eyes tightened. "Try it again," she said. The florist did. Declined. A waiter carrying champagne slowed as he passed. Two donors near the railing stopped speaking. Vanessa lowered her voice. "Use the secondary authorization." The florist tapped again, this time entering the code Richard's office had sent earlier that evening. Declined. Across the mezzanine, Richard saw the hesitation and walked over, irritation already forming before he knew the problem. "What is going on?" he asked. Vanessa turned the tablet away from the guests. "It is just a bank delay." Richard took it from her with the easy impatience of a man used to being obeyed by systems he did not understand. "There is no delay," he said. "Call the account manager." Someone offered to step aside for privacy. Richard refused. Privacy was for people uncertain of their power. He dialed from his own phone and put on the polished voice that had carried him through boardrooms, ribbon cuttings, and photographs beside hospital beds he visited only when cameras were present. "This is Richard Whitmore. I need the Foundation authorization restored immediately." The woman on the line asked him to verify his access code. He did. The room had not gone silent. Not completely, but sound had begun to drain from it. Glasses lowered. Conversations paused at their edges. Vanessa crossed her arms, still performing calm, but her fingers tapped against her elbow in quick little beats. Richard's expression shifted first into confusion, then annoyance. "That is impossible," he said. "Check again." The voice from the phone remained even enough to be heard by the people closest to him. "Mr. Whitmore, your authorization was suspended at 11:28 p.m. All secondary signatories are currently frozen pending founder review." Vanessa's face lost its warmth. "Founder review?" she whispered. Richard looked toward the ballroom doors, as if Eleanor might still be standing there waiting to be dismissed. But Eleanor was not in the room. That made it worse. For the first time all evening, the absence he had mistaken for weakness began moving through the hotel like weather. The phone remained in Richard's hand long after the call ended, the screen dimming against his palm, while the mezzanine watched him forget how to perform confidence. Vanessa reached for his arm, but he stepped away before he realized he had done it. The movement was small, almost polite, and it wounded her more publicly than any accusation could have. "Fix it," she whispered. Richard looked at the declined invoice, then at the donors standing nearby, then at the ballroom doors. "This is a misunderstanding," he said, though his voice had lost the smooth finish that usually made lies sound like strategy. At 11:57 p.m., the music lowered without anyone asking. Not stopped. Lowered, as if the hotel itself had sensed a different kind of arrival. Heads turned toward the marble staircase. Eleanor appeared at the top step in her ivory coat, the dark blue checkbook held against her side, no longer hidden, no longer offered to anyone else. Beside her walked Alexander Hale. The room recognized him in layers. First the silver hair, then the composed face from financial magazines, then the quiet shock of realizing the richest man in the building had not entered through the gala line, had not posed for photographs, had not come for Richard. He had come with Eleanor. Every conversation fell apart. Vanessa's hand tightened around the tablet. Richard's expression shifted into calculation, then concern, then something close to fear when Alexander did not greet him first. Eleanor descended the stairs slowly, not because she wanted drama, but because she refused to hurry through a room that had once hurried past her. She reached the mezzanine at 11:59 p.m. Alexander stepped forward, his voice calm enough to make the silence complete. Hale Private Bank has activated the integrity provision of the Whitmore Children's Trust, he said. Effective tonight, all secondary authorizations are suspended pending founder review. The foundation's assets, grants, and donor funds remain protected under Eleanor Whitmore's sole emergency authority. Someone near the railing inhaled sharply. A board member who had avoided Eleanor earlier looked down as if the marble had become fascinating. Vanessa forced a laugh, brittle and bright. That is impossible. Richard approved my role. Eleanor looked at her then, not with hatred, not even surprise. Just the clean attention of a woman finally seeing a stain in full light. Richard could not give you what was never his, she said. Vanessa opened her mouth, but nothing useful came out. Richard moved closer, lowering his voice as if privacy could still be rescued from a public record. Eleanor, do not turn this into a spectacle. For the first time all night, Eleanor almost smiled. Not warmly, not cruelly. Simply with the tired recognition of a woman hearing a man name the fire after handing someone else the match. She placed the checkbook on the nearest cocktail table and opened it to the page Vanessa had signed. The ink looked theatrical beneath the chandelier, all loops and borrowed importance. A spectacle, Eleanor said softly, was allowing another woman to sign my name in front of 300 donors. The clock above the ballroom doors struck midnight. No bell rang. No glass broke. Nothing dramatic happened, except every screen in Richard's financial world refreshed without him. Alexander's phone lit once. He glanced at it, then said, "The freeze is complete." Vanessa stared at Eleanor as if waiting for rage, because rage would have made the story easier to dismiss. But Eleanor only closed the checkbook. "Permission from a man," she said, "does not give you ownership of a woman's work." And in that sentence, Richard finally understood that Eleanor had not returned to beg for her place. She had returned because the place had always been hers. By morning, the hotel flowers had already begun to wilt. White orchids that cost more than a month of rent leaned over silver vases in the empty ballroom, their perfume trapped beneath chandeliers no one was looking at anymore. The headlines did not use Richard's favorite photograph. They did not show him at the podium, smiling beside a hospital banner he had never earned. They showed Eleanor Whitmore walking out of Hale Private Bank at 12:23 a.m., ivory coat over one arm, dark blue checkbook in her hand, Alexander Hale beside her, and no expression on her face that anyone could reduce to heartbreak. By 6:40 a.m., Marjorie Bell had filed the emergency governance notice. By 7:15, every discretionary vendor tied to Vanessa Blake was under review. By 8 o'clock, the Delaware company had lost its pending transfer before a single dollar moved. Richard called Eleanor 17 times before breakfast. She answered none of them, not because she had nothing to say, but because silence had finally become accurate. At 9:10, she arrived at St. Agnes Hospital wearing a simple navy dress and low heels, her hair pinned back, her wedding ring absent. No reporters were invited. No board members followed. Only Marjorie walked beside her with a slim folder, and Alexander remained near the lobby doors, quiet enough to let the moment belong where it should have belonged all along. In the pediatric wing, the air smelled of sanitizer, warm oatmeal, and crayons. A nurse named Paula saw Eleanor and pressed one hand to her chest in relief. "The surgical grant came through?" she asked. Eleanor opened the checkbook on the nurse's station counter. The same checkbook Vanessa had lifted beneath chandeliers now rested beside a plastic cup of pens and a stack of coloring pages. Somehow, it looked more powerful there. Eleanor wrote the amount carefully, not $2 million for applause, not $12,000 for imported orchids, but the exact number needed to keep a 7-year-old girl named Lily Carter on the schedule for her procedure that afternoon, plus travel costs for her parents from Pennsylvania and 2 weeks of recovery, housing within walking distance of the hospital. Her signature moved across the paper in one clean line. Controlled. Angled. Unmistakable. Lily sat nearby under a pink blanket, holding a stuffed rabbit with one bent ear. She watched Eleanor the way children watch adults who enter hospital rooms without fear. "Are you the lady who owns the money?" Lily asked. Paula smiled nervously, but Eleanor only knelt so her eyes were level with the child's. "No," she said gently. "I am the woman responsible for where it goes." Across town, Richard stood alone in the penthouse kitchen, watching the news without sound. Vanessa's name had disappeared from the gala website. His own seat on the foundation board was marked suspended pending review. The life he had built from borrowed light looked strangely dim in the morning. At St. Agnes, Eleanor handed the signed check to Paula, then turned toward the window where sunlight spilled across the hallway floor. She did not feel victorious. Victory was too loud a word for this kind of peace. She felt returned. She had not ruined them. She had not chased them. She had simply taken back the one thing they should never have touched: her name.